This is a book that I've written with a friend of mine, Ben Powell. Ben's a free market economist like myself. He teaches at Texas Tech University, which is about 5 hours away by car from where I live. But we're both in Texas, but it's quite a distance away. And we're very good friends, and we're reasonably accomplished academics. He runs a center at his university as I do at mine. And we like to travel. We like to drink a lot. And we thought, well, heck, let's combine the things we like in life the most, drinking and traveling and talking and doing economics. And so that's what we did. It didn't start out as a book about socialism. It literally started out as, hey, let's go drink and do economics someplace. And we went to Cuba for the first trip, and this is not really the cover of the book. It's coming out in April, and the publisher hasn't given us an actual title. We just made this up. But the book evolved, though, after we went to Cuba. We said, you know, Cuba is really weird, and I'll talk about it in a minute. Maybe we should do a book about traveling to socialist countries, or former socialist countries, or past whatever. And so that's what the book became. And so let me talk a little bit about the structure of the book. There's 8 chapters. This is not a book advertisement. I don't even have a book to sell, so it'll be available on Amazon in April, I think. But there's 8 chapters, and each one is a country, and there's sort of a play on words at each time. So the first chapter is not socialism, and we talk about Sweden. We were in Sweden together for a meeting, and that's not socialism. So we talk about that, and then we'll talk about Venezuela, Cuba, Korea, China, Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, and then back in the USSA, because we went back to the United States and did something about socialism in the United States. So anyway, the book is basically us traveling to these different places and what we saw. And one of the things when I teach economics, I like to tell my students is that economics is like a set of eyeglasses. You know, when we look at the world without economics, it's blurry, like you all are now blurry. But when I put on my economics lenses, the world gets clearer. That doesn't mean I can see everything, right? I can't see great distances. There's still, even with glasses, with lenses, you can't see everything. But it does make the things you can see clearer. And that's how we think economics is. We think economics, when we travel even, when you're, if you know when you're in a foreign country, things are confusing. It's a little bit different, and you're not quite sure what's going on. Economics is our way of trying to make this blurry, confusing world that we live in a little bit more understandable. So let me just take you through a little bit of our travels through the world. I should have a beer in my hand because Ben Powell is the biggest alcoholic anyone I know has ever met. And I had trouble keeping up with him most of these trips. So our first trip is to Duval Tavern in Stockholm. We were at a meeting in Stockholm, and we were drinking these very nice beers. Ben is the fellow on the left, the redhead, and that's me on the right when I was about 15 kilos lighter, was running marathons and such. And the guy in the middle, we don't care about the guy in the middle. His name is Brad, but you don't know him, so it doesn't matter. So we were sitting there drinking, and Ben was complaining about the price of the beer. I think the beer was, 7 or 8 euros, $10. It was expensive. And I said, well, they have taxes here. Yeah, so, right. So I said, well, they have high taxes, and that's why the beer is expensive, and that's actually true. They do have high taxes on alcohol, and that's why the beer and such is expensive. But, the thing about socialism, as I sat there at Duval Tavern, is who owns Duval Cafe? Who owns that? I don't know either, but somebody, right? Some regular person owns that tavern. Who owns, in front of us there was a street and there were Volvos and Saabs driving by. Who owned those Volvos and Saabs? Individual people. The buildings that we were around, that we could see, they were owned by individual people. Is Saab owned by the government or the I believe it's a publicly traded private firm. It's owned by private individuals, right? So when you think about socialism, the classic definition of socialism is when there is collective ownership of the means of production. When the means of production, that is the land, the labor, the capital, the things with which we use to make things, those means of production, that those things are owned collectively. And in practice, that means they're owned by the state in every instance. Not every instance, but in most instances. Is Sweden a situation where we have collective ownerships of the means of production? It's not, right? It doesn't pass the most basic textbook test of what socialism is. It's something else. We have names for it. We've talked a lot about Sweden here. Everyone loves to talk about Sweden. It's a lovely place. If I could turn the whole world into Sweden overnight, I would do it in a heartbeat, and I would go get an honest job like bartender or something. It's a lovely place, but it's not socialism. It's a market economy where private property dominates and markets dominate. And the price system works. By price system, I mean the prices of the goods and services. The price of that beer, although it was taxed, was set by the marketplace, not by a government agency. There's no government agency of beer pricing that sets the beer prices in that country or anything else. It's a system where the prices are allowed to go up and to go down with respect to supply and demand, all the things we teach about in economics classes. So it's not a socialist nation. It does have high taxes. And I think we can talk about among the market economies, among the market-oriented countries like the United States, Hong Kong, and Sweden, we can talk about some of them have different flavors of market economics. And some of them, like Sweden, have higher taxes and a little bit higher welfare state, although as Jose mentioned, the welfare state in the United States isn't dramatically less generous than that of Sweden in many ways. So that's the first chapter. And this was just an introductory chapter for us to sort of lay out the groundwork. Hey, we want to write a book called Socialism Sucks. We ought to talk about what is socialism. And well, it's the collective means of production, and it is not Sweden. So we're not talking about Sweden. If you love Sweden, great, good for you. Sweden does not suck. Actually, that would have been a great title for the chapter. Sweden doesn't suck. Sweden's a lovely place. All right. So let's go to some places that claim to be, or nominally, are socialist countries. And even here, there'll be flavors. There'll be shades of gray and degrees of socialism. But I think each one of the examples we have here are countries that pass the test. And then, so the first chapter, the real chapter, is starving socialism. This is Venezuela. And Ben and I are Americans, and we're also lazy. And you need a visa to get to Venezuela, and we forgot. So we're like, well, I guess we're not going to go to Venezuela. Let's go to Colombia. Colombia's right next door. And we'll fly from Bogota to Cucuta. Cucuta is a city, a fairly large city. I think it's nearly 1 million people. It's several 100,000 people. It's a large city. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere. And there is a little river that is the border between Venezuela and Colombia. The river is not navigable. It's like a stream. You could wade across it, really. It's not. I assume when it storms, it gets bigger, but when we were there, it was nearly dry. So we went to Cucuta, and we went to the border, and there's 2 bridges. I forget the names now. They're in the book. And the bridges you can see here on the left and also on the bottom middle. And people are walking across. So the bridges are closed to traffic. I think it was the Venezuelans who closed it to traffic. The Venezuelans said, we don't want people driving across, because if they drive across, they will, they'll never come back. So people walk across, and by the thousands. This was January of 2017. Just not that long ago. If you see the bridge today, you would multiply the number of people on this bridge by 10. So when we were there, if you just had a clicker, like clicking people, it would be hundreds of people per hour, thousands of people per day. Today, if we were there literally today, it would be 10 times that many people crossing the bridge. Now, they're not actually, most of them are not emigrating. They're not leaving Venezuela permanently to stay. They're not refugees yet, although some of them are walking across and have no intention to return. Most of them are going to go shopping, because one of the hallmarks of socialism in Venezuela is price controls. Prices are controlled at every level, retail level. There's a price control for bread, price control for what you can sell. Beer. And one of the things about socialism, almost everywhere it's been tried, when they set prices for the economy, they always set them below equilibrium, which is to say they set them too low. And what happens to all my econ majors out here when you set prices below equilibrium? It's like you get shortages, right? We used to call the Soviet Union the shortage economy because they would set pervasively, almost every price was set too low, and you couldn't find anything because the prices were below equilibrium. This happens to the entire economy in many places. So the people coming in are coming in with bags, like airplane luggage with wheels. The children carrying little bags, the men and women carrying large bags, sometimes 2 or 3 bags per person. They're heavy on the way in. They're filled on the way into Colombia, out of Venezuela. What are they filled with when they leave Venezuela? Money, yeah, bolívares. Today you heard about, from our good friend, you heard about the inflation. When I was there, it was still not as bad, but I think I gave a $20 bill to a guy on the street, and I'm sure he robbed me, but he gave me a stack of $100 Bolivar notes this large. That was $20. Okay, $20. That was the highest note that they had. The 100 Bolivar is the largest note. So that's $20. So if you wanted to buy a car for $1,000, okay, right? You could do the math, right? It would take up, so they bring in suitcases of cash. So they're heavy on the way in. They trade it as quickly as they can because inflation's fast, so you want to get rid of them as quickly as you can. And you trade them on the street at probably horrible exchange rates. A little story, I asked him if he had any 20s and 50s, the notes, and he laughed. And he says, he reaches in his bag, he throws me a few bundles like this, and he says, gratis, it's free, have these. He's like, I'm tired of carrying them around. It's like someone leaves a penny. You can have the penny, it's no problem. So I have all these souvenirs, money. So, so they're coming in, and then they're shopping. And what are they buying? Are they buying, like, when you go to a foreign country, what do you buy? You buy jewelry, right? You buy, nice things. You buy fancy wine to take home. What are they buying? They're buying rice, beans, sugar, aspirin, deodorant, shampoo, soap. They're buying tires. There were huge stores in Cucuta with tires. You can see some of the shops there filled with goods. This is the Colombia side. And they're buying tires, which is really weird. Venezuela is an oil export. We make tires out of oil, right? More or less. I mean, and they come to Colombia to buy them. So they fill up their bags, and then they walk across carrying their bags filled with their rice and their beans and the sugar and other things of daily life, and they make it back. So many of the people that are doing these trips on a semi-regular basis are locals who live in that region of Venezuela. But we talked to one couple. His name was Paulo, and she was Maria. And they were from Ciudad Bolivar. Ciudad Bolivar is 1,200 kilometers away. It's about 800 miles away. It's almost on the Guyana border, on the other side, the Brazilian Guyana border, on the other side of the country. And it took 3 days to do this. It should only take 1 day by car, but the roads are bad and it's too dangerous to drive at night, so they took 3 days. So they went 3 days, 6 days if you go both round trip, to buy groceries, to go to the market. And Paulo spoke reasonably good English, and he worked in a hotel. He was a middle class person. If you look at the people in the picture, they look poor. Are these poor people? These are not peasants. These are middle class Venezuelans. So, one of the things about the travels, very quickly, as we learned, it's a wonderful thing to talk about price controls and shortages and supply and demand graphs in your textbooks. But when you see the real world implication of it, it really meant something to us. Actually, there's Ben holding a bunch of money. It's kind of blurry, but that's only about $10. I think we split the $20. He got half, and I got half. We thought about going to a strip club and, being rich, but then I think the girls who, when they realized we were giving out Bolivar, they would probably get mad at us because,
This is a funny story. I had a colleague, at a different newspaper who got really drunk, and he went to a strip club, and he had like the lowest illumination. So he was talking about hundreds. He had like 5s or something. and he started just taking big chunks and started trying to shove it at the like girl's underwear, and she just started punching him. She was let out of a club.
I'm pretty sure if I've thought about it, some other jerk has thought about it too, and I'm sure the girls are not real happy with that practice. So we, in terms of so we tell these stories about us traveling, interviewing people like Paolo and Maria, sitting here in the dusty sun, drinking a beer, watching these people. So poverty is not, unfortunately, is not terribly unique to the world. I've traveled to some 60 countries. I've seen poverty, and some of the world's worst poverty, in fact. I've seen it. This was almost worse, because although poverty is horrible to see, and it's a thing. This was middle-class people. And in some cases, I saw one family that looked objectively rich. They arrived in a yellow taxi, for one thing, which means you must be rich, because no one can afford a taxi. And these are middle-class people who are now being reduced to driving, 1,200 kilometers to go grocery shopping. This is a level of devastation, economic devastation, that it's really hard to describe until you actually see it. As I mentioned, it's much worse today. The crisis has continued to just get much worse than it was 2 years ago. And now these bridges if you've seen photos, and journalists go to this place just like we did, because it's the most iconic place you can go to see the people leaving Venezuela. Now many people leave Venezuela, they then become refugees in Colombia. It's hard for them, though. They can't really work very well easily, except illegally, and they can't leave Colombia without documentation, so it's difficult for them. We also use this chapter as an opportunity to talk about democratic socialism. We did touch this earlier. The thing about this type of socialism is it was at least initially done democratically. Chavez was elected democratically, and Maduro was more or less fairly re-elected to his term. With that said, this type of economic control, the type of economic control where you are going to control every price in the economy, requires political control. You can't have that much economic control without simultaneously having the political control. So the newspapers have been shut down, many of the radio and television stations have been shut down, journalists have been persecuted. The few demonstrations that have been attempted have been met with fairly violent reactions. So political repression is, I think, a necessary flip side of the coin when you have economic repression of this type. You simply can't repress people's economic lives this much without giving the power to the police state to enforce it. And so the two go hand in hand. So my American friends who want to talk about how pretty democratic socialism sounds, they really need to travel to Cucuta and see it for themselves, because none of the people that I saw have much to say good about any of the situations. So that's Venezuela. Let's go on. Each one of the chapters, I should mention, each chapter, what we tried to do, we didn't want to just tell a chapter where each chapter says, oh, it's another socialist country and it sucks. So each chapter we tried to develop a theme. The theme for the Venezuela chapter was mostly about democratic socialism and how political repression is a necessary part of it. The Cuba chapter, and we went to Cuba, I think it was May of 16. And the Cuba chapter became a price theory chapter. We didn't mean it to be one, but it became about the economics of prices. When you first go to Cuba, it looks pretty normal, sort of. The airport's kind of dingy, but it's a Caribbean island, and they're all kind of not nice. I've been to Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Virgin Islands. They're all kind of run down. It's humid. The usual people yelling at you when you get there, you want to ride, and the usual stuff. I did do something different right away, though, when I got to Cuba. I changed money. I had cash with me, which is, first of all, strange, because I arrive in most countries with no cash. I usually go to an ATM machine, right? When I get off the plane in Paris, I go to an ATM machine, I pull euro. In Cuba, I actually brought US dollars with me. I think I had 2,000 US dollars, which was a large amount of cash to carry for me. And I changed it at the airport. Now, what do you guys think about that? No sane person changes money at the airport. Everybody knows this is the worst exchange rate that you could, this is what it's going to be. But I did it in Cuba. You know why? because Cuba owns the airport, they own all the banks, they own all of the places for which you can exchange, and the price is the same everywhere. So this is the one place on earth where it's actually not a bad idea to change money at the airport. No, well, no, you can buy things. You gotta have, So that was the first thing. And then I decided, let's stay at a hotel. So a friend of mine from Mexico, he used to be a CIA guy, actually. It's weird. And he was in Cuba, and he said, oh, stay at the Hotel Trinton. Hotel Trinton is this building in the middle there. It was built in the 1970s. As you can see, it's a wonderful hotel. It's 3 stars, 3 Cuban stars, special kind of stars. Every one of the top windows is broken. I think only the first 10 floors or so are still occupied. And the pictures, like on the top left, that's the bathroom. It did have air conditioning, thank goodness. But it's not the worst hotel I've ever stayed in, but it's on the list of the worst hotels I've ever stayed in. The elevator, 3 of the 4 elevators didn't work. The one that did work took 5 minutes to go 10 flights, and I was afraid to take it because I figured we would get stuck. And so one of the contrasts was the private versus the public here. So we stayed in a hotel. It's government owned. All the real hotels are government owned. But they have allowed in the last few years private people to let out rooms like Airbnb. In fact, we rented one on Airbnb, and this is weird. There's no internet in Cuba. So how do you, there is, but not really, there's no internet. How do you rent Airbnb? Well, what they have is they have relatives in Miami who set up an Airbnb account in Miami, and they rent, and then they just call them, and it says, okay, Bob Lawson is renting the place Tuesday, and he'll meet you, and so you meet the owner of the flat, you meet them at the place at the point of time. So they have an intermediary, and that's how it works. And I think I paid $50 for the hotel room in the Hotel Trinton. And the nice 2-bedroom apartment that I rented with 2 air conditioners, 1 for each room, it was glorious. A nice refrigerator that had several beers. I don't know, they must have been left over from the previous tenant, but I was happy to have free beer. And it was $25. And the lady helped me get a car, and the cars, I'll come to some prices in a second. The cars are pretty interesting. You've all seen the car pictures in Cuba, the American. I'm a car guy. I told you I have a 1969 Volkswagen Beetle. But we said, oh, cool, I get to go in a 56 Plymouth, And then you realize that it's a 56 suspension. And the engine is actually a Fiat engine because the Detroit engine blew up 25 or 30 years ago. And it's no air conditioning, and actually the American cars are terrible. You may not appreciate the prices here, so I'm kind of an old car guy. In the United States, the classic mid-50s Plymouth or Chevrolets that we would see everywhere in Cuba, in America, that car would sell more or less as scrap, even on the collector's market. You might get $2,000 to $3,000 or $4,000 for one of those cars in the American collector's market, in the condition they're in. If you have a pristine 1957 Chevy, it's worth $100,000. But one of these cars in that condition in the United States, $2,000. It's a restore car. Maybe you would just use it for parts. How much do you think that these cars are worth in Cuba? There is a secondary market. So. Yeah, a lot. Like a lot. Like $18,000. That little, I think it's a Renault or a Peugeot in front. Yeah. Now that's a fancy car. You see, that's built in the 90s, not the 50s. It's 40 years newer. Now that Peugeot, I think it's a Renault. That Renault in America, if you saw a 1991 Renault on a car lot in Dallas, Texas, how much would it be worth? $500. He would give it to you. Yeah. He would say, if you will pay the tax and title on this, you can have this. This car is worth less. It's worth nothing. It's worth $100, maybe. These cars are junk. In Europe, too. A 30-year-old Peugeot, in the condition that this car is in, is worth nothing in France. You wouldn't give it to a teenage kid. Right? $35,000 in Cuba for that car. Right. Yeah, well, that's the point. They're illegal. And it's not the American embargo. The Cuban government will not allow the importation of cars. And so it's supply and demand. If you restrict the supply, Cuba's a terribly poor country. Estimates of the income in country, maybe best case, I think, is about $5,000 per person. I think it's probably less, but it's hard to tell in Cuba's case because they don't use prices, so it's really hard to tell what anyone makes and what anything's worth. It's just difficult. So, but yeah, so the Cuban government will not, but it's supply and demand. If you limit the supply of something, even in a poor country, if you limit the supply of something enough, its price will go up. It's just supply and demand. As I mentioned, prices are completely messed up. So we talked about the food. This is travel tip 101. Everybody knows these things until you go to Cuba and you realize like I'm changing money at the airport. This is insane. Everybody knows that the hotel on the square with the fountain, of course the fountain doesn't work because it's Cuba, but the old colonial square with the fountain and the old beautiful hotel, everyone knows that coffee is stupid expensive, right? It's, you're going to pay €5 or $5 for a coffee or something, right? And the beer is going to be, and if you order a Jack Daniel's, it's going to be $20. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows that the fancy hotel on the square is, and if you really want quality tourist experience, you go find the alley, and down the alley, and there's a restaurant or a bar there, and that's where real people go, and you go there, right? That's what real tourists do, except in Cuba, because the prices are the same everywhere. So after 3 days of sitting in alleys, drinking $5 beers, actually the beers were $2, let's say $2 beers, and then we realized, wait, the beers are also $2 at the hotels, looking on the balconies where there's some sea breeze coming in, and you can see so we stopped going into the little corner places, the little hidden places. We started going into the balconies and the fancy looking places, and it was exactly the same price as everything else. So one of the things about prices, and we didn't talk about this in our lectures, but prices are the guides. They tell us what to do. They don't tell us, like, order us what to do, but in our lives, prices are how we navigate this complicated world we live in. If there's a disease in the chicken farms, chicken prices go up, and it sends a signal to all of us to eat a little less chicken, because chicken's now more expensive. If there's a flood and all the lettuce gets destroyed, the price of lettuce goes up, and we stop eating as much lettuce. Prices are the signals that we use to guide us through our daily lives. And when the prices are set by markets, they work. They work in the sense that they help guide us to eat less chicken when there's been a problem with the chicken production, or eat less lettuce if there's been a flood. But in Cuba, it doesn't work that way, right? And they guide us to like, why is it more expensive at the fancy hotel? Because if it was in normal world, like at Tel Aviv, fancy hotel, the Ritz-Carlton, why is it expensive there? Because if it wasn't expensive, everyone would go there and it'd be too full. So they raised the price, and that's why people don't crowd out those places. But in Cuba, it was the exact opposite. The prices are all the same, so we started doing things that are dumb. They weren't dumb in Cuba, they were smart, but they don't make sense to us who are used to market prices. So when you have an entire economy filled with mispricing, your behavior changes, and you start doing things that really don't make sense, but then they do make sense. They make sense in the context of the misprices that you have in the economy. One last anecdote about Cuba. On the bottom right there, it's a bad picture. They were very sensitive about taking photos in government, in shops. All the shops are owned by the government. The only things that are private in Cuba are you can rent a place to stay, a home, or apartment or something, and that's done through a loose network. Airbnb is one way, but there are other networks. And there are private restaurants now too. But the private restaurants were the same as the public restaurants. I couldn't really tell much of a difference. But the shops that you would go buy things were really quite strange. So this shop, I think, if you look in the bottom, there's some plumbing fixtures, plumbing parts. It's like pipes, little plastic PVC pipes. And then I think there's some bowls, and I think there's ladies' underwear in that on the right there. And behind, and I know there's some like cleaning products. This is the strangest store And it was like this everyone you went to. It was this random collection of items. And it's because it's a shortage economy. That means it's really hard to find things to sell, too. I mean, because if you're a vendor, you buy things from the wholesale market and you resell on the retail market. But it's hard to find anything in any market. So when you find something, you buy it and you put it in your store. So the stores are these random collections of products that don't actually go together in any sense. I've never, you don't see plumbing parts and ladies' underwear in the same display case. At least I've never seen it. Yeah.
You just buy the product and sell it at the same price?
No, they can't actually mark up. They do have some ability to raise.
Okay.
Yeah, at the retail level.
I think one thing you didn't mention is that the tourist has another currency.
Yes.
They have two currencies.
There's
They have
There are two
and this is almost
currencies.
equivalent to dollar or euro, and there's the Chilean peso, which is
Right.
more or less.
The problem with the two currencies is Gresham's law really hits in here, and the only currency that we ever saw was the so-called tourist version, but even the locals were using it, and I think that they fixed the exchange rates between these things. So Gresham's law says that basically, if you have two currencies trading on a par, the lower valued of the two will be the only one that circulates, and that's what happens. So that's what's happening there. Technically, the locals are supposed to use a separate currency, but the reality is, and this was true not just in Havana, and we've traveled all over the island, and every place we went, I saw no pesos, the traditional pesos. I saw none of them. You have to worry about getting them because they're like 25 to 1. So you have to worry about someone giving you bad change but we never had that problem. I was expecting that to be an issue, at least when we were there. The other peso doesn't seem to circulate. People trade it in. It's illegal. There's a black market for that. But.
Yeah, it was just surprising. The woman that I went to Cuba and the woman that hosted us, her profession, she was a lawyer. And she told us that the money that she gets for one night from hosting tourists equals to 1 month of paycheck. So
Absolutely.
she just left her old job, and of course, and many people want to work with tourism because you use the other.
Yeah, there are two assets that a Cuban can have that can really make their life better off. Number one is having a car, because a car is an income earning asset. Every car is a taxi. It doesn't have to have taxi on it. Every car is a taxi. If you own a car, you are renting it out. You're driving people around for money. And then the other one is English. Or some other language, but so because that just gives you amazing opportunities, not just official opportunities, but unofficial as well. So again, we turn this in, Cuba's weird. It's the strangest place I've ever been, and we were trying to figure out why is it so strange. It's not strange because it's poor. I've been to poor countries, and when I go to poor countries, the Ritz-Carlton is expensive. The normal poor, if that makes any sense. This is weird poor, and the reason it's weird is because of the price system being so tightly controlled by the central authorities, and you don't get that until you experience it. I never stay I never would have coffee at a Ritz-Carlton balcony or something. That's the stupidest thing for a tourist to do. You're just giving your money away, except in Cuba, where after a day and we realized what the system was, we exclusively were eating and dining and drinking in these very fancy places, because why not when the prices are all the same. A lot of other weird things about Cuba. Maybe during a break we can talk about it. All right. So the next trip on our drunken tour of the world I should be drinking right now, is about Korea, about primarily North Korea, and we called the chapter Dark Socialism. Yeah.
Why aren't the places if the prices are the same, so why all tourists don't go to the Ritz-Carlton?
Yeah, there aren't a lot of there's some tourists, but there aren't a lot. It's a difficult place to be. I don't recommend it as a tourist destination. I've heard that the Canadian resorts are nice with the beaches, but it's not an easy place. It's adventure tourism still. Everything's hard in Cuba, so there are tourists to be sure, but it's not a lot. you know. So anyway, the next one is, it's called dark socialism. Has anybody, you've all seen that, I don't put it in any of my slides because it's kind of, I think, trite at this point. You've all seen the satellite photo of North and South Korea and all the lights in South Korea and the darkness. So we flew to, we were in Seoul for a meeting, and we went to the DMZ in South Korea, the border of North and South Korea, and that's a tourist trap, so don't go there. Don't go. The DMZ tour is a waste of a day. And the reason is the DMZ's 12 kilometers wide. You can't actually see North Korea from South Korea, and they don't let you, get up right to. There's a couple little things, little museums and things, but it's a tourist trap. So we flew to Dandong, China. Dandong is on the Yalu River, and it's on the border, northern border of North Korea. And in there's a city, and there it is up on the right there. That's Dandong. It's not Shanghai or Shenzhen, but it's a pretty substantial city. It's a city of several million people with high-rise business and residential buildings that go for several miles or kilometers down the river. It's a beautiful. And at night, of course, it's all the lights and things that you see in Chinese cities. It's not as impressive as Shanghai by any means, but it's a very substantial city. We arrived at night and went to our hotel and decided to go walk around. We went down to the river, and I took that photograph right there. It's a full moon, so the big bright light there is the moon. And across the river is North Korea. As you can see, there's a couple lights you can see, but it's pretty dark over there. The scene behind me, I didn't get a good picture of it, but the scene behind me of China is that skyline all lit up. And so that satellite photo is not photoshopped. I mean, it's quite real. You're standing on the border, and you can look down one side and it's just walls of light, and the other side is absolute darkness, a few little pinpoints of light. Without the moon, it would have even been more impressive because the moon is actually reflecting quite a bit. And then we wake up in the morning, and that bottom picture on the right, there's actually a city over there, several 100,000 people, North Koreans living in the city. I forget the name of the city on the Korean side. They're mid-rise buildings. You can see there's a lot of warehouses and things along the dock there. There's dredging operations in the river. So I went out into the river on a boat, and so I was as close to North Korea as you are. I'm an American, so I'm not going to go into North Korea. I'm not an idiot, but so we went there, and we had great hopes for this chapter. Oh, we're gonna talk to North Koreans like we talked to Venezuelans, and we didn't find any. Anybody know why we didn't find any North Koreans? Well, they can't get out. I was surprised. Like, why can't they just swim? It's not a very big river. I mean, I'm not a very good swimmer, but I could swim that river. The river's mine, so and there are guard towers. That blue thing, they paint their guard towers this baby blue. It's very unnerving. So they're all over. So they're not allowed to leave, of course. And if they do leave, there are rewards for Chinese citizens to turn them in. So the Chinese people who find Koreans frequently will turn them in, and the people that they get sent back to, we can only speculate as to what horrible fate awaits them if they get sent back. But there aren't a lot of North Koreans just sort of walking around Dandong, China, unlike Cúcuta, Colombia, where there were thousands of Venezuelans to talk to. There is a big smuggling operation. I was with a Chinese journalist who was working with underground, mostly Christian people who are smuggling people out. But you can't just smuggle them to China. You have to smuggle them all the way through China out to some other place. Get them to Mongolia. That's the typical pattern, is get them to Mongolia. And once they're in Mongolia, they can fly. And there's large North Korean expat communities in Thailand and Malaysia, actually. So we only talked to one North Korean. She had just come over from China, but her parents were Chinese, so she was not an illegal North Korean refugee. She had the right to be in China. Her parents went to North Korea to escape China, in the 70s. Her parents were doctors, and during the Cultural Revolution, this was not a good time. So they fled to North Korea, and things have not gone so well for them there, obviously. But by virtue of being born in China, she returned to China. But she really didn't talk to us much. We had a translator with us, a friend of a friend, but she was too afraid to talk to us. I mean, I can imagine her situation. 2 Americans in Dandong, China. I think we were the only Americans we saw in 3 or 4 days in the city. And I mean, the presumption, and it would not be incorrect, the presumption is that we're probably spies or something. And so she didn't really talk to us, unfortunately. Anyway, so we didn't get a lot of good information about Korea. So we wrote the chapter up, and it's not as good as the other ones, but it was still a good experience. All right. And then there's China. I want to talk a little bit more substantively perhaps about China. So we went to Beijing, Shanghai. I've been to Hong Kong, which is not really China, but I've been to Shenzhen. This is fake socialism. Now, why do I say fake socialism? They still call themselves socialists. They still call themselves communists. And why is it fake? Well, remember that definition? The ownership of the means of production. The big reform that China made a few years ago was to legalize private property. And they leased out at 99-year leases agricultural land to the farmers. So the farmers went from working on government-owned, communally owned farms to owning their own plots of land, albeit on 99-year leases, but that's a sufficiently long time that you can do pretty good economic planning. So China is actually a country of more or less private property. And the buildings you see there are not owned for the most part by the government. They're owned by private individuals who have raised the capital to build those buildings. And the banks that are in them are frequently owned by the government, but the foreign banks are not. And you can see that it's fake socialism. It's no longer the case that the Chinese government owns the means of production. Most of the means of production, the land, and the labor, the people, where do they work? Can they change jobs? Do they need a government permission to change jobs in China? No, they do not. So the labor is free to move around and work where it wants. The people that own the land are able to employ that land for whatever economic purpose they want to employ it. If you want to build a building, you are free to do so. It is essentially become a market economy. I don't put the word free market economy in front of that because it is still a tightly controlled, regulated economy in many, many different ways. But compared to its old days, it's no longer really a socialist country. It is still a politically repressive country, and that dimension has not really been reformed much.
What do you think it will be the future of China, like in the economic status?
Yeah, so the future of China?
Status, yeah.
Can I add to a question?
Yeah.
After transforming all the working bean factories to Vietnam and Turkey and other countries, what industry will specialize?
So, well, China is big enough that they can specialize in many things. They're going to have comparative advantages in many, many, many different things by virtue of their sheer scale. But the point is, the whole point of a market economy is it's not up for anyone to decide what they specialize in. It's up to the Chinese to decide. And if you think you've got a comparative advantage in a particular activity, then you get to go do that. We have the freedom to do that. So it's actually hard to predict ex ante. It's hard to predict beforehand what any country will specialize in. It's hard to specialize. People specialize in things that they think they're good at. Technically, the things that they can do at low cost, but what they're good at. But it's hard for economists to predict that. So I don't actually have a strong view of what they should or will do on that front. As far as prognostication goes, I will say that, let me just frame this in terms of the Economic Freedom Index. Remember we talked about China. We didn't have a number for Maoist China, but let's say it was a 2, and now they're a 6, I think 6.5. Going from a 2 in economic freedom to a 6.5 in economic freedom is a huge amount of liberalization. And with that much liberalization, you turn China from being a country of a couple $1,000s per person to a country like this, that we see this here, where I think the per capita income in China now is certainly north of 10,000. It's probably $15,000 per person. So they've increased their average income for 1 billion people, right, by like 7-fold in the last generation or so. So huge progress. But going from a 2 in economic freedom to a 6.5 and going from $2,000 to $15,000, that's one thing. Going from a 6.5 to an 8 in economic freedom and going from $15,000 to $30,000 or $40,000, that's a whole nother thing. And I think we're seeing China slowing down because they're finding that they don't want to liberalize to the Western European standard, or to the, not forget about the Hong Kong standard, but they don't want to liberalize even to the France standard. France is a 7.1, another half a point. They're finding that they don't have the political will to liberalize their economy that deeply. And I think that's going to limit, in the long run, it'll limit how far they can go. But when you start at $2,000, you can grow like crazy for a very long time with just a little bit of liberalization, and that's what's happened. I am skeptical, though, about the long-run prospects, unless they keep the process going, and they haven't. They really stopped. Sorry.
Do you think the privatization of China was better than what happened in Russia?
Yes, I do. And the reason for that, well, there's two reasons for that. One is there was a lot to privatize, but a lot of Chinese assets were just basically given to the people who were on the ground. So if you were a farmer, they didn't sell your farm and give it to some fat aristocrat or oligarch. They just said, here's your farm. And if you were the management team of a factory making Chinese tires, under old communism, and the factory's making tires, it's bad at it because it's socialism, but all of a sudden they say, hey, this asset can be sold. They pretty much went to the management of the bureaucrats who ran the thing. So you guys want to keep it? You guys can just run it now. You guys are in charge. And it was done in a more, I hate to use the word democratic, but it's like a small d democratic way. It was, most of the assets were given to the people who were more or less using them already. They didn't just sell them off to billionaires, which generated a lot of the animosity. But also, a lot of people just walked away from those assets. The assets weren't worth anything, so they just walked away. And China, unlike Russia, China invited so much foreign investment in. Most Chinese said, I don't care about the rubber factory or the tire factory. I'm going to go work for the Apple factory, which is a brand new factory. It didn't even exist. There was nothing. It didn't have to privatize it. It didn't even exist. It was built from the ground up after the reforms. So most of the stuff wasn't taking old assets and seeing who should have them. It was just building new assets. It was a little bit different. But I also do think it was done less, it was less crony than the Russian example. Crony to friends, corrupt, less corrupt. Yeah. Let's see. Was there anything else? Yeah.
When you were there, did you meet like the middle-aged class? Because I know there's lots of rich people, and there's lots of very non-rich that work in the fabrics, and it's like.
Yeah, I didn't get out of the cities. I mean, Beijing's 20 million people, Shanghai's 20 million people. So these are massive cities. I like to joke that my city is as big as your country, but my city these are 2 or 3 times the size of my city. And it's just middle class people everywhere. I mean, just millions and literally millions and millions and millions of middle class people walking all around you. They're clearly not uber rich billionaires. All right, I know that. There can't be 20 million billionaires in Beijing. So there's 20 million people, and when you see them walking on the streets, it looks almost like you're in any regular city. The clothing they wear, the cars that are on the streets, the restaurants and the food and the entertainment that's available, it is obviously middle class. Now, I don't know what it's like to be a rural farmer in China, and I'm sure that's still poverty. But the middle class, the existence of it and the scale of it is really shocking. It's no question about it. So I don't have numbers for you on that, but it's not just some oligarchic Chinese guys. I'm sure there's no shortage of billionaires in China now, but it's truly just a working city. People have regular jobs at banks, finance companies, real estate developers, whatever they're doing, agricultural importers, everything, and it's pretty normal. I mean, it's not exactly like Paris, but it's a normal-looking, working city experience filled with people who, in my estimation, are living pretty dignified lives. You know, they work, they're doing, you know, children in strollers, you know, all the things you think of as seeing as normal life. I didn't really expect it to be that normal. I kind of expected it to be very, very fancy and then lots of poor people, almost like a Latin American experience. If you've been to you know, it's not like that. It's much more of it does appear to be more leveled than what you would see in a Latino context. I should mention there's the political repression. So I went to a meeting. I was in Seoul. We flew to Beijing, and some of our friends that were in Seoul said, "Hey, we're going to a meeting in Beijing. You should come." And I'm like, "I'm only going to be in Beijing for 2 days or 3 days. I'm not going to waste it hanging around a bunch of boring economists." So they said, "Well, we have drinks." So we said, "Okay, we'll come at the end of your day." And so we arrived about 4 o'clock to a conference, and it was a conference with Chinese academics, about 25 Chinese economists and political science professors, and they were talking about Friedrich Hayek and Ayn Rand, of all things, in Beijing. It was a very, so there is political liberalism of a sort. It was okay. I'm going to qualify this in a big time in a second. We're to the point where a bunch of Chinese professors who are all working in state universities could go to a meeting. It was publicly announced. It was not a secret meeting. They could go to a meeting and talk about Friedrich Hayek and Ayn Rand. That is something that, of course, was unthinkable in China, you know, until the 80s. The bad news is we flew away. The next morning, the conference was continuing. The next morning, the conference was shut down by the government physically. They arrived with armed guards, and they literally took a chain and locked the doors of the building so that people couldn't get into the building. And this made the news. And Ben and I were really mad because we had flown off. We'd flown off to Shanghai, and we were really mad because that would have been really good for the book if we were there when they closed the meeting down. But they didn't do it till the morning after we left. So China is struggling with its political liberalism. I think they know that a rich people are going to require some openness politically, but the government is clearly not willing to give them much room for political openness. I will say that the conversations were surprisingly frank. There were several Chinese people, I wouldn't quote them name by name for fear of their safety, but there were several things said in that meeting that shocked me. I mean, they were in a Chinese context, they were treasonous. I mean, I would consider them to be normal talk, because American, whatever, I can, you know, I'll talk about Trump and call him a war criminal or whatever, I don't care. But the things these Chinese academics working in state universities were willing to say at this semi-open meeting was really eye-opening. And I thought, this is great, China's on the way to political liberalism, and then the next morning it all came crashing down. So maybe they bugged the room, I don't know. All right. So that's our chapter on China, but it is fake socialism. We talk a lot about how the development process works in market economies. You start poor, you start investing. It's never rational. There's always problems. The capital market in China is a disaster. The banking system's a mess. There's all kinds of problems, but it's starting to move, and you see the progress that's happened with the cities. And then this is not entirely a pun, but it's partly, we went to Russia and Ukraine. We called this chapter Hungover Socialism, in part because Ben and I were always hungover, but because they're trying to get over their socialism, right? You know, they were socialists, they were communists, socialist central plans for so many years. And so we went to Kiev and Moscow. And what's happened in both places to varying degrees is that are they socialists now? No. Again, who owns the means of production? The regular people. Maybe the oligarchs, but at least they're not the state. It's not communal ownership of resources. It's a bunch of jerks who own it, but okay. Yeah. And it's a market economy in a formal sense, but of course we know that the rules and regulations that the government has are being used to the benefit of a small elite in both countries. So I don't consider it to be authentic free market capitalism, but it's not quite Soviet central planning either, because there is not a central plan anymore. There's no one, they don't have a plan. It's just a bunch of rich oligarchs raping and pillaging the country, in both countries. So when you get there, though, it looks normal again. If you go to Moscow today, it looks like any other regular city. It's kind of boring, frankly. I was expecting to be more exotic. It's not. It's, it looked like it could have been Stockholm or Warsaw or Vienna or any other place. It's just a normal European city. There was very little evidence of the old Soviet times. There's a picture of an old cosmonaut mural that no one bothered to take down. And then the line there, the only line, so Soviet Union, of course, was famous for its lines, right? And the reason they had lines was because everything was too cheap. And when everything is too cheap, we have shortages. And when we have shortages, people form lines. So the Soviet Union was famous for its lines. And we saw no lines except one place. This is the line to get in to see Lenin's body at Lenin's tomb. By the way, the price to get into Lenin's tomb is $0. There is no admission charge. And so more people want to get into Lenin's tomb at a price of $0 than can be accommodated by the tomb. And as a consequence, lines form. Ben and I went into this line, looked at it 3 times and said, no way am I standing in a line to see Lenin. And we finally broke down and did it at the end. And Ben got yelled at because he gave Lenin the middle finger. And the guard did not like that, so he got yelled at. In Russian, I don't know what the guy said, but it was obvious that what he said was, stop doing that, you dumb American. This chapter is mostly a history chapter. I don't need to go into the history here. It was just a discussion of the Soviet Union's formation, the Bolsheviks in 2021, and so forth. Today, it's just another boring, corrupt country, and there are 60 or 70 or 80 or 100 more of them around the world that are pretty much just like Russia today. It's like Latin America, most of Africa. There's a bunch of rich people who are using the government to rig the system in their favor. That's not that interesting to me. The history of Soviet central planning is terribly interesting. And we talk a lot about that in the book, but the visit itself was not that great. All right. Second to last trip, and you guys may have questions on this. I know more about Georgia than any other country probably outside of the United States, which is not saying a lot, but it's true. So we called the chapter for Georgia capitalism. It's not socialism or fake socialism, it's capitalism. Georgia, after independence in 1991 from the Soviet Union, fought 10 years of civil wars, had a leader who was a corrupt oligarch named Shevardnadze. He was a Georgian, but he was a former top Soviet official. So 10 years of civil war, 10 years of oligarch, terrible hyperinflation. The lights are out. Georgia's a disaster. In 2003, they have a second revolution. It's a peaceful revolution. No shots were fired. They called it the Rose Revolution because the leader of the revolution was a guy named Mikhail Saakashvili, and he would carry red roses around. And this was his signal that this is not a violent revolution, because he didn't want the army and the police to attack. So he would show up with bouquets of red roses, and he would hand them to police officers and hand them to security officials for the old government, and say, hey, we're here peacefully, and it became called the Rose Revolution. The government fell, the government came in, Saakashvili became president. Saakashvili is a Western-trained, Columbia-educated lawyer, wears Italian suits, speaks excellent English, he's very charismatic, probably a liberal, but what he did is he hired a fellow to reform the economy named Kaha Bendukidze. Kaha was an oligarch of a sorts. He went up to Russia and bought some companies and made a lot of money when he resold them. He bought them, fixed them up, invested in them, and then flipped them. He flipped them. He bought low and he sold high. And he made a lot of money. He came back to Georgia. What Saakashvili didn't know is that 2004. The Rose Revolution was November 2003, so the new government came in January of 2004. So Kaha came back in January and was named Minister of the Economy or Minister of Economic Reform. It's a small country. About 4 million people live in Georgia. They're not really sure how many people, because so many people have left. They haven't done a proper census in decades. So somewhere between 4 and 6 million people live there. And Kaha's crazy. He's about 150 kilo, big man. He died young. This is what happens when you weigh 150 kilos. So sad, because he was a good guy. So Kaha was crazy, and he had this window of opportunity where they had just taken over the government. They had extremely high popularity from the population, and they were able to, they had control of the parliament, so they had backup from the local politicians. They were able to initiate a series of reforms that has taken Georgia, as you know, to the top 10 of the Economic Freedom Index in about a 10-year period. Just give you some examples of what Kaha did in Georgia. Kaha would walk into a government ministry. One of the ministries I like is it's not a ministry, it was the Office of Price Controls. You know, so, by the way, there were no price controls in Georgia. So the Soviet Union had price controls, so they had a Soviet agency called the Agency for Price Controlling, and it was in charge of all the prices in Georgia. Well, in '91, when the Soviet Union fell apart and they declared independence, they got rid of all price controls. So they didn't have any more price controls. But they still had the Office of Price Controls with several hundred employees 10 years later. So Kaha went into the office and said, "What are you guys doing here?" He said, "Well, we're you know, what are we doing here?" And so he said, "How many people are here today?" And like 6 people were there out of the hundreds of people that were supposed to work there. They'd been paid for all this time, yeah. Not much, but they're paid. And he fired them all of them, except for the 6 that were there.
We have in Israel too, but we don't get fired.
Yeah, so that's just it. He fired them all. He went into government office after government office. This is not an exaggerated number. This is a factual number. 90+%, over 90% of the executive branch of the Georgian government was fired, let go. What are you talking about? You're gone. You know, you're gone. They show up with armed officers and say, "You guys are no longer have a job here, and this ministry is now closed." They closed 6 of the 17 ministries completely. They said, "We don't even have this ministry anymore." All right, and they sold the building. This was not done. They had the backup of the politicians, and they had the parliament. The parliament had given them the authority to do this. So it was not outside of the law, but it was done quite quickly and ruthlessly. You know, not literally. Nobody got beat up, but it was done. So. Another example, they had a road police that was corrupt that would stop people with cars and take bribes. And you couldn't drive across. When I was there the first time even, there was still a little bit of this. But they fired 30,000 police officers in a single day. This is a country of 4 million people. So they literally let go over 100,000 government employees. They fired over 100,000 government employees in a country of 4 million. So that would be like 200,000 Israelis, government officials, gone in, say, 6 months. They're just, with there was no pension. I mean, if they were eligible for a pension, they could, whatever, but there was no payment. "Hey, sorry to see you go. Here's a little bit of money to see you along." They just left. And so this was radical downsizing of the government. They also did a lot. They added a flat tax. They eliminated all tariffs. They have no tariffs at all. 0 tariffs. They went to a flat tax. They have a simple flat tax and a simple VAT. That's all they have, really, from a tax point of view. Massive privatizations. So.
What do you mean when you say tariff? Sorry?
Tariff. Tax on imports. My accent, sure.
So you heard tariff. So,
Yeah.
You're in Israel, so.
Yeah. So. The question about how, let's compare, I would like, it's worth comparing the Georgian privatization process with the Russian one, or the ones that went down in a lot of the other Eastern European countries. Yeah.
Did it cause any riots, these kind of letting go?
No, actually
People
not.
just went quietly, they felt so guilty that they just went home.
Yeah, actually.
Okay.
It was, I get that question a lot. I've asked my Georgians, they're like, No, they just left. And now they're running businesses.
Yeah, they managed to.
Yeah, unemployment sky. I have a paper where I looked at the unemployment rate. It did go up. I mean, it went. I actually measured employment. Employment fell like 20%, but by 5 years later, it was back up to where you expect. So the privatization is one of my favorite stories. So the government was broke. They'd been fighting civil wars and had hyperinflation. They had debt. They had no tax base to tax, and they needed money. The government needed money to do some infrastructure. The roads were just the worst roads I've ever seen. The airport had bullet holes in the walls. The first time I flew there, the old airport, the first time I flew in, there's bullet holes. I'm like, what am I doing here? So they needed to fix the airport, they needed to fix the ports, they needed to get the infrastructure, and they needed money for this, and they didn't have much of a tax base yet. So they had a lot of state-owned enterprises because they had not done a lot of privatization yet. They had done some, but not a lot. They had a lot of assets, hospitals, power plants, hydroelectric power plants and gas plants, had a lot of agricultural land that was still owned by the government. It was being run by a farmer, but it was technically owned by the government. A lot of buildings, like the ones you see there. Residential buildings that people lived in were still government owned, just like in Soviet times. Now, I don't know if this is because of Kaha or because they had seen the Russians botch it, but Kaha came in and said, let's not do it the way the Russians did it. As you know, the Russians gave out vouchers. Most of the vouchers were sold for a bottle of vodka to unscrupulous oligarchic traders, and it did not end up well. It was a PR disaster for markets. Kaha said, you know what? It's 2004. We have the internet now. We're just going to have an auction on the internet. So you can actually get your cell phone out now. It's privatization.ge, and you can look up. Most of the good stuff's already sold, I'm afraid, so it's not very exciting now. But they literally held online open auctions, not a straight old English auction, highest bidder auctions, nothing crazy. And it was transparent. Each bid was known. You couldn't secretly bid, right? And if the highest bidder was a Russian, an evil Russian, which if you're Georgian, that's redundant. All Russians are evil if you're Georgian. If it was an evil Russian who happened to buy it, then an evil Russian's going to get that hotel. Very famous hotel was sold in Batumi. Batumi is a resort town on the Black Sea, one of the best hotels in the whole country. And an oligarch, a Georgian oligarch, was set to buy it for $80,000. And at the last minute, Kaha said, no, that's not how we're doing it now. We're going to put this online and we're going to have an auction. And a Russian won it for $23 million. Yeah, it's $20 million. So the government got $23 million instead of $80,000. And it went to the person who was going to actually invest and run that enterprise for a profit. He wasn't buying it to be a plaything. He was buying it to be an operating hotel. And in fact, he's invested a lot of money in it, and it's now one of the best places to stay in Batumi. So unlike the Russians, the Georgian privatization process was clean and transparent. It raised a lot of money for the government, which was needed in the early days for their infrastructure needs. And it was really in stark contrast to what went on in the other countries. And as a result, if you ask Georgians about the privatization process, the normal reaction for a person on the street was like, yeah, it worked pretty good. We made a lot of money. By we, they mean the government raised a lot of money. They didn't get any of those assets. By the way, you can buy something now that's like, you can buy for $500, you can buy a small agricultural land. If you want to buy a little building in some village in Georgia, it's all online. It's still for sale. Most of the valuable assets have been sold. Anything at this point that's been sold is not worth much. That's more or less the story of Georgia's reforms. I could go on about Georgia, the country, if I want, but let me ask a question.
How's the crime rate these days?
Georgia? So, non-existent. I mean, Tbilisi, I think, is the safest city I've ever been in, especially in the context of being a poor country. Poor countries tend to have a little bit of street crime, pickpockets, things like that. It's a normal part of life in rich countries too, my country. But for a poor country, it's by far the safest city I've ever seen. But the real criminals were the cops in the old days. And the joke in Georgia is that after they fired all the cops, crime went down. And it's true, because they were the criminals. Today, it's a stupid little practice, but it illustrates the new way of doing things. The police officers, they have their lights on all the time because they're not trying to hide and find you. They're trying to tell you, hey, I'm here to help you. It's just a little stupid little gimmick, PR gimmick, but it illustrates the new system. It's another silly thing the government did is they made all the police buildings, they're all new. They're all made out of glass because that's transparent. It's stupid, but this is the kind of thing. So it really did filter down to the population, though. I've heard from some friends who live there now that there's a bit more street crime in the last few years. The new government's not as vigorous about this as the old government, so there may be some revision. But I still wouldn't. I would send my daughter to Tbilisi, before almost any other city. It'd be fine. Yeah, it's a very, very safe place. Nothing like Armenia or Azerbaijan. I tell you that. I've been to the other two South Caucasus countries, and when you're in Armenia, if you're in Yerevan, every time I've been to Yerevan, I've been assigned a guard. Which I mean, in Tbilisi, I go run, I go jog for 2 hours in the middle of the streets. No one, So, but in Yerevan, you got to have a guy with a leather jacket and an Uzi. So, it's very different. Yeah, it's not like the other countries. It's very different. And it was not like that. It was one of the most dangerous places in the world before the Rose Revolution. It was very quick. The new government lost its election. The government that I like, Saakashvili's government, lost its election attempt in 2012 for two reasons. One is the war against Russia didn't go well, and some of the Georgian voters blamed Saakashvili for that. But the other problem is that the government was pretty ruthless about crime and corruption. So if you took a $50 bribe after the Rose Revolution, you took a $50 bribe, you might get sent to jail for 20 years. I mean, brutal. And then Georgian prisons, so one of the things that happened is a bunch of scandals broke out. People smuggled in iPhones to the prisons, and they took pictures and videos of prisoners who were just being horrifically treated. And the new government lost. In no small part because of that, and frankly, they should have. It was on their watch, and it was their prisons, and they were letting that happen, and I think they knew about it. But the upside of that, though, was that crime and corruption just went to nothing in a 5-year period because, again, they were ruthlessly attacking the problem, maybe a little too ruthlessly, even for political, because they ended up losing their political power over that issue. But. Anyway, I'm a big fan of Georgia. Food and wine is the best in the world.
How is their GDP now?
Yeah, so it's hard to measure. They've been growing very quickly since the Rose Revolution. They've been putting up 6 to 8% growth rates a year. It's not been uniform. The Russia year was bad. The 2008 was a recession because of the war. 6 to 8% a year. They started out at about 5,000 GDP per capita. They're probably over 10 to 12 now. It's still a poor-ish country, but it's on the verge of getting into the realm where we start saying middle income. You start that low, and it wasn't like they were ever putting up, 12% growth rates like China, And the difference between 5%. 5% is a great growth rate. 5 or 6, 7 is good. 8, 9 is good, but 12 is, that's a whole nother game. So they've been growing very rapidly. And even under the new government, the growth rates are positive. I think they're down to like 5%, but that's a strong growth rate. A lot of fundamentals are a problem. Of course, you got hostile neighbors, and it's not landlocked. They do have the Black Sea, so that's an asset.
And the population is growing, stagnating, or?
No one knows. So at least 1 million and maybe 2 million Georgians left the country. They're in Europe or the United States. Probably closer to 1 million. The numbers are all over the map. It's truly, no one knows. They just did a census and no one believes it. It's a mess. It's hard to say. Not much going back in though. I mean, at this point, it was more out. I think the best thing you can say is that the out migration has stopped. I don't think there's a lot of return migration yet. There were some refugees from Armenia and Azeris who came in, but that's not much either. So, yeah. Last thing, we did a wine tour yesterday. Georgia has a different wine style. They make wine in the normal style, but they also make it in the old world style, which is really cool. You just throw everything in a pot and let it wait. The red wine comes out about the same, but the white wine comes out almost orange because it's still got all the stuff in it. They don't take out the skins early like they do with white wine. So the white wines are very different. I wouldn't say they're good, but they're just different. Yes.
Sorry, back to Georgia. How do they score in your rankings?
Yeah, they're 6th or 7th in the index.
6 to 7?
Yeah, total, overall.
They've been moving up?
Well, at this point, they're not because they've already kind of reached the top. But yeah, they've gone from, I didn't get them until 2004. So by the time I even got them, things were already on the upswing. But I have them going from about a 5 to a 7.5. It's a 2.5 unit increase. That's about a unit. It's just pure coincidence, but 1 unit in the index is about a standard error, so it's about a 2.5 standard error increase. It's one of the biggest. Israel's is bigger from 90 to present. There are some other countries that have bigger ones, but in terms of fast and big, there's no country that even comes close to being as fast a reformer and as big. If you combine sort of how quick you did it with how big it was, Georgia's #1. Yeah, it's stunning. And it hasn't reversed. The new government really hasn't. Their rhetoric has been less friendly to markets, but they really haven't changed any policies. So, all right. Okay. This is the last thing, and this was a last-minute addition. I don't have a lot of photos on this, as you can see, but Ben and I, we'd written this book. We were shopping it around to publishers. We workshopped it with some friends and colleagues at a university seminar. And one of them said at the very end of the day, he says, you went to all these socialism conferences. Socialism is getting popular in the United States. I wonder if there's a socialism conference in America. And so I hit my Google, and sure enough, in July in Chicago, there's 2,000 American socialists who go to a hotel, and they pay a registration fee, and they go to sessions, and they call each other comrade. And that's I don't know why it's called Rob L. I hate the word Rob for my name, but and no one had their last names on because I think people were afraid that the CIA is looking at them. But a bunch of young people, more or less your age, thousands of them at a socialism conference. And we attended. I didn't lie. I didn't hide my identity. I wasn't a secret recorder or anything like that. But I registered for the conference, and Ben and I registered. We went. We made a little fun of them. We had a little bingo game we were playing. If you can't read that, it's like dreadlocks, Che Guevara t-shirt, acoustic guitar, marijuana smell. That happened very quick. I think like in the first 5 minutes of being in the hotel, I'm like, I got the marijuana smell. So we were having some fun with them. But seriously, we interviewed these students, and I was genuinely interested and curious as to why America is not as free market as I would like, but it's a pretty free market country, and it's a pretty rich and prosperous nation, and a lot of good things happen. It's not perfect, but like, what's the allure? Why do you think socialism is the way to go? I've been to some of these places. It doesn't look that great. So there's two answers. One is, oh, no, we don't mean that kind of socialism. So the first line that the socialist kids at the conference said, we don't mean Venezuela. That's state socialism. What we mean is socialism from below. That's bottom-up socialism. Well, the workers are going to run things. It's like kibbutz socialism. We're just going to have like little local communities, and they'll own the factory or the farm or the whatever, and we'll vote on things. We're not going to have a state. So it's almost like anarchic socialism. I'm no historian of kibbutz, but I also noticed that most of those didn't do really well. But that's what they want. They're not advocating. So the good news is, I'm happy to report, is that there weren't 2,000 American students in Chicago who really want the world to turn into Venezuela or North Korea. That's good news, yes, thankfully. They have this romantic idea of socialism from below, which is like this little commune type thing where we're all going to live and vote on things. And I found it horrible in a way because the world we live in, that's a poor world. That world that they envision, if it ever happened, would be a poor world, a materially poor world, because the standard of living that we enjoy requires large extended trading networks. And these people want to have these small little communities that kind of, maybe you work a little bit, trade a little bit with your neighbors, but they're against global capitalism. And so their economics is terrible. But at least they weren't Stalinists, mostly. There were a couple, but not mostly. But even then it was better, because when I would talk to individuals, so do you think the government should own all the farms? And they're like, no, that's crazy. Who would think that's a good idea? I'm like, well, it's a socialism conference, and I think that in the book of socialism, owning the farms is usually like on page 1, right? Communist Manifesto. And they're like, no, we don't mean that. Oh, well, why are you here? And well, I'm in favor of abortion rights. I'm like, oh, okay, and so am I. That's cool. It's great. Or I'm in favor of immigrant rights. I'm like, oh, really? Me too. I'm like, I like immigrants. This is good. I think Trump's a jerk. So when it came to the specifics of these students, most of them were just left-wing American college students, and I'm a libertarian, so I was like, half the time I was talking to them, I'm like, yeah, I'm cool. We're friends. And then they would say, we need to tax the rich. I'm like, whoa, wait, what? No, I'm not against it. I'm not for. So, but they were forgive me, they were Democrats. They were just center left, maybe a little bit more than center, maybe more left than center, but they were just fairly conventional American leftists who it's gotten cool to be a socialist and call each other comrade. So that's the good news. I think it's a fad. It's going to go away. You guys are young, but all my old Bob back there, all us old farts who are like, what are these kids talking about these days? Socialism. The good news is I think it's a fad. I think it's a fad. It's not. It's cosmetic. And that's good news. And in fact, some of the things these kids are talking about, we should be talking about. We should be talking about police, in the United States, we should be talking about police violence against blacks. We absolutely should be talking about that. And the fact that these kids are doing it, I'm good with that. So some of the things I was applauding these kids, I didn't have a problem with them. Again, until they started talking about, taxing they were like, tax the rich until there are, notice the song, with tax the rich until there are no rich no more or something. There's a song said, I saw t-shirts like that. And then they started talking about how they want to live in these little weird communes and not trade with it was weird. The economics was pretty ignorant, but it wasn't Lenin and Maoist level. So, well, yeah, of sorts, but they don't understand the economics. Sweden isn't a bunch of communes and workers getting to vote on their pay raises. Volvo is a modern capitalist corporation, and Volvo hires workers at the cheapest rate they can find them, and they sell their cars at the highest price they can sell them at. And the shareholders are looking for return on their investment, and if they can buy cheaper metal from Indonesia than they can, so they have a completely misinformed idea of what even Sweden is. But that's okay. People who are ignorant about something can learn. That's fine. They're ignorant, but they're not evil. I was expecting to see 2,000 evil people, like 2,000, Stalins. Stalin was an evil guy. We went to some town in Georgia. It was I'm reporting good news. The good news is they were just a bunch of mostly uninformed leftist kids. Their hearts were in the right place, more or less, and that was gratifying. I think they need to learn some economics, that's all. So anyway, that's my trip to around the world. I don't know if that's interesting at all, but again, the big story is that because we were economists, we were able to go to Cuba and say, hey, you know what, this weirdness is because of price controls. And because of the economics that we have, we were able to see a little bit deeper into these communities that we're visiting for just a week or two at a time, a few days at a time. We're able to see and get a little bit more out of the experience than I think you can if you don't know economics. And that's it. But socialism definitely sucks. Venezuela ran out of beer once. How do you run out of beer? Like, this is the last thing I would run out of. So they ran out of beer. They absolutely ran out of beer. All right, I'm done. Thank you.